Psychedelic music is a genre of rock that came to prevalence in the mid-60s, largely taking off in the American West Coast and San Francisco. The new and unique sound of the genre was made to capture the feeling of depersonalization and detachment from reality expressed by the other elements of the 60s. Psychedelic music brought about the people commonly known as hippies and helped in expanding the hippie culture and its ideals throughout the world. The rise of psychedelic music peaked in 1965 with the rise of the psychedelic scene itself, having a hotspot of activity in the American West Coast, largely due to the audio engineer and chemist Owsley Stanley, and the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey, who were prominent figures in the beat culture as well. Kesey and his merry pranksters introduced the widespread popularity of LSD to the West Coast population, along with their ideals of free thinking and free love and ways of life. During 1965, while it was making its first impression on the public, Beach Boys leader Brian Wilson started to experiment songwriting while under the influence of LSD. Also during this time, the Beatles, shortly after being introduced to cannabis by Bob Dylan, also began experimenting with LSD while making music. This gave both bands the opportunity to work and experiment with new technology and new ideas over their albums, using a new range of studio tricks that would incorporate them into key roles in the development of the psychedelic sound. A major contribution to the launch of the psychedelic culture was the Grateful Dead playing at the San Francisco acid test parties, a series of parties held by Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters, centered entirely around the use of LSD. Kesey, being friends with members of the Grateful Dead, let them play at the parties with black lights, strobe lights, and fluorescent paint to reproduce the drug's surrealistic fragmenting, thus giving the Grateful Dead their newfound fan base and popularity in the psychedelic culture. Arguably the most impactful and important bands of the psychedelic scene included that of Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company, The Velvet Underground, Pink Floyd, and the Grateful Dead. A big part of the start of the psychedelic culture itself was beat poetry and culture, led by people like Allen Ginsberg, Neil Cassidy, Jack Kerouac, Ken Kesey, and a few more. Beat culture was essentially the predecessor to hippie culture. They were a group of poets, writers, idealists, and enthusiasts that introduced and popularized the psychedelic drug LSD to the American population in the 60s with the acid tests, in which beat culture evolved into its new subpart. The music had started mostly by those who were part of the beat and hippie culture, and once the genre became widely known, it had also brought more awareness and popularity to the cultures as well. During the time from the mid-60s to 70s, a good chunk of the population flocked towards the cultures and lifestyles, people seeking spiritual freedom and new ideas. That culture and way of life have stayed prevalent ever since and still influence people to this very day. The whole psychedelic and hippie culture played a big part in the peace movements and protests against the Vietnam War and the draft for the war as well. It created a mass group of peace-loving and freedom-seeking people. And for that, the world will be forever grateful.